Basically, what I'm saying is we already live in a post-liberal world. It's just not the kind of post-liberalism that someone like Patrick Deneen would like to see. And what I wanted to just draw attention to is just how much our institutions have changed in the past 40 years. And that's important because there is a way of defining liberalism where you define liberalism in terms of a set of institutions. And my point is to say these institutions don't exist anymore, or their function of them has so radically changed that we have to be attentive to that. A lot of what happens in the 1970s is just institutional changes and then the proliferation of practices that emerge when you develop these kinds of institutions. You change the law and you change the regime, that means you're changing the soul of the citizens. We talk in the language of free and open society, and yet with the application of the war on terror, our institutions operate in extremely different ways. That have nothing to do with being free or open. 2022 is really a decisive moment for this because the thought is, well, let's use this to take down a $3 trillion. Let's use this to target the Russians, the Russian central bank, and knock them out of the global economy. And what happened was that it failed.
You summarize the article, last paragraph, first sentence, quote, "The central drama of the last 3 decades has been the fusion of state and society," end quote.
I think we just need to see the 90s as a revolutionary period. We're fine not to think of it like that, as a period of calm. And my central contention is that it's the quiet revolution.
All right, I had a fascinating discussion with Dr. Nathan Pinkoski today. He has studied at the University of Alberta, and he achieved his doctorate in philosophy and politics from the University of Oxford. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Renewing America. And he's a writer for First Things, Compact. He's a columnist. He has a book coming out. He's on contract right now, and it's tentatively titled Actually Existing Post-Liberalism. Most of our discussion was on the article in First Things that is the title of his book, so Actually Existing Post-Liberalism. And his opening line from his article is that 20th century civilization has collapsed. It rested on an essential tenet of liberalism, the state-society, public-private distinction, end quote. And he said that distinction is gone. We have a fusion of state and society, and he gives example after example after example of how that fusion has happened, and that liberal era, if it ever did exist, is thoroughly behind us. And so we need a new way of thinking for today's world on how to think about government and society and politics. So definitely a name that you need to be paying attention to. He's got his book coming out. We don't have a release date for that yet, but and he's a Canadian, or he has Canadian roots, and so a fascinating discussion. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thanks for watching.
Concepts with Sean Watley.
Dr. Pinkoski, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you here. Now, you just had a move. You're in the DC area, is that right? That's where we're getting.
Exactly. Yeah, just moved there, so lots of unpacking to do.
Oh, brilliant. So I appreciate you making the time. I wanted to start actually and introduce this whole topic with an article that you wrote about Alasdair MacIntyre. It's an obituary. It just came out last month, and you titled it Post-Liberalism's Reluctant Godfather. And there's a sentence in there where you say, you could survive in mainstream philosophy as a theist and even as a Catholic, like Charles Taylor has done, and he's a Canadian philosopher, quote, but you had to wear your liberalism on your sleeve, end quote. Explain.
Well, yes. So one of the things I think is really fascinating about the movements in political theory and philosophy in the 70s and 80s, and MacIntyre sort of part of this, is a sense that, all right, we have this predominant order, this predominant political order, liberalism, and how do we understand it? How do we relate to it? And a lot of thinkers who were critical in some respects were very careful to couple that criticism with a sense of that they were defending this, or was sort of like a healthy, friendly critique. So Charles Taylor talks about liberalism as a muscular creed, for instance. So it's an attempt to try to re-articulate it, to give it a stronger foundation. And I think what's downstream of this exercise rather is downstream of the fact that MacIntyre and Taylor are both they're post-Marxist thinkers. They grew up in an environment and media that was much more hostile to the dominant political order, much more hostile to liberalism. But over time, as their thinking matured, they moved in a different direction. But what separates them is that Taylor is someone who sees that the war is, in the last analysis, something to defend, whereas MacIntyre did not take that approach. He's much more of the enfant terrible who kept that criticism up. And so you can see this, I think, really in the 1980s. People were obviously fascinated by After Virtue when the book came out, because MacIntyre was such a distinguished philosopher, like Charles Taylor, had written on numerous subjects, a great demonstration of his intellectual breadth. And yet, After Virtue was not a book that pulled his punches when it came to speaking about liberalism. And Taylor, by contrast, was someone who was very careful to do that. And we can see that, too, in his own kind of political involvement as well in the late 80s and the early 90s, when he gets involved with the commission in Quebec. This is, I think, the early 2000s. And he joins the commission that the Liberal Party set up to basically try to articulate what secularism should look like in the Quebec context. But this is a man who's very much part of the establishment, right? And MacIntyre, by disposition, by intellectual formation, by practice, right, did not want to ever have that. So that's one of the big, I think, interesting divides that is produced in that time. And we can also say too, if you pass through graduate school, kind of in the early 2000s or even in the 90s, of course, you were inducted into this whole liberal communitarian debate, and it kind of faded off. I think, and one of the big reasons it faded off and hasn't really been talked about much since is the sense that these were really, despite the fact that this was supposed to be a great debate, a great conflict of the grand ideas, or calling into question our political form, kind of throwing in new energy to try to think of some kind of alternative. It was really two sides of the same coin. Both positions agreed on the fundamentals. Both positions were they on the matter of rights, speaking favorably about human rights, about building a political order based on that. Both were effectively in agreement that had to be there. And you can see, in contrast, MacIntyre in After Virtue has the famous passage where he speaks about human rights as unicorns. So again, completely different attitude. And the reason why MacIntyre has lasted, whereas a lot of the kind of communitarian debates of the 1980s, Michael Sandel's say critique of Rawls, for instance, why those debates have kind of floundered out, or those texts aren't read anymore with the same kind of attention that After Virtue is because you see MacIntyre was someone who really wanted to challenge that. The other people, not so much.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, there's a beautiful line in your article. I just had to share it because it kind of encapsulates why Alasdair MacIntyre is so fun to read, and everybody in the audience, you need to read After Virtue.
Absolutely.
You put this sentence, quote, I guess Alasdair MacIntyre's message was this, quote, "We're dumber than we think because we've lost more than we realize," end quote. And yeah, that was a beautiful summary. And I haven't read his books, Which Justice, Which Rationality. They're on my shelf. But and his other books too, which I'm a loser there. But yeah, After Virtue is great, and they are on my reading list. So that's my excuse. So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, simply that I would encourage more people to read them. And I think, just to go back to something I said there, After Virtue is a book that you can pick up, and you can see it in part as a historical set piece. You can look at it and think, well, people at this particular moment in the early 80s, you can understand the concern about the rise of liberal individualism, but there is still a freshness and energy applicability of his diagnoses that really describe our own situation, and
Yeah.
which makes it something very, very relevant to read nowadays, and just as perhaps even more so than in the 1980s, because we see that a lot of his diagnoses really confirm our own world, the world we live in, a very fragmented world.
Yeah. And so your summary of MacIntyre and your comments about liberalism have set up our discussion on your article titled Actually Existing Post-Liberalism. And it came out in the November issue of First Things. And the lead article in that issue was The End of the Age of Hitler, which is also a fantastic article. But we're going to be focusing on your article titled Actually Existing Post-Liberalism. And I'm just going to read the first sentence. I thought it was brilliant. And hopefully we can go through it in a little bit of detail. I'll just read, not so much detail that this is like defending your PhD thesis. No, don't worry about that. But I do think
Really,
I do think it was brilliant. And I'm
thank
not
you.
surprised that you have a book contract on this article, but you start this way, quote, 20th century civilization has collapsed. It rested on an essential tenet of liberalism, the state society, public-private distinction, end quote. Explain.
Yeah, so two things are going on there. One is, first of all, that I think it's important for people to see that this is a reference to Karl Polanyi's, the opening line of the Great Transformation. His book, which described two things. One was the collapse of the 19th century civilization, and then second, how we got to 19th century civilization. So, what I was trying to do with that setup is to point us toward a period where we tend to think mostly in terms of long-term continuity, or kind of the realization of a set of ideas that say we're there in Western Europe, in North America, and then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, you just get expanded to Eastern Europe, perhaps to the rest of the world. To say that we should actually see this period as a great transformation, a kind of revolution, in the way that Polanyi describes the coming into existence of the 19th century. So that was the parallel I was trying to point at. The second thing is just that I think when we're trying to look at or understand the way that liberals spoke about themselves, so define liberalism in the mid 20th century, so much relies on this state society distinction, this attempt to demarcate an independent civil society that is distinct from the state, not controlled by the state, right? Hence the independent. The other thing is the public-private distinction, and the determination to try to defend the private sphere from the government. A lot of the Cold War liberals really have that kind of idée fixe, where we have to stop totalitarianism. We have to have a political system that holds off, that prevents the state from encroaching on the social sphere. That's the way. If you ask your kind of man on the street, sort of, or intellectual man on the street, perhaps, to define what totalitarianism is, that would probably be the definition that someone would give. There's no private sphere. Everything, the social sphere, is controlled by the state. That's the definition that they would give. So this is really key to looking at liberalism and understanding it. And my argument is the great transformation, if you will, that happened it started before. I think that's one side, but that really got entrenched in the late 80s and the 90s, is precisely the breakdown of this, really the banishing of it.
I didn't know you were referencing Polanyi, and I should have caught that. I am embarrassed that I didn't
No
recognize
worries, no
that.
worries.
Yeah, because I have that book over there too. And we won't talk about Spengler and Polanyi and how they may or may not be related. But I wanted to say that the fact that you set it up that way is not simply an intellectual presupposition, but it's actually an emotional presupposition, a bias, a way that we assume life works. And so that's what makes your article so unsettling, because you go fact after fact after fact after fact from the 1970s forward, and you just say, you grab the reader by the lapels and say, okay, wake up. this is what's actually happening. And we're going to dive into that a bit. But just before we do, you use the term post-liberal, and there have been some fantastic books and articles on post-liberalism, but you are talking about a different kind of post-liberalism or a different take on it. You're calling it actually existing post-liberalism. So can you just make a very brief comment, or as long as you want, about how what you're talking about is different than the other books and writing that we've been reading about post-liberalism?
Yeah, so basically what I'm saying is we already live in a post-liberal world. It's just not the kind of post-liberalism that someone like Patrick Deneen would like to see. And so it's an account of looking not at the predominance of a certain set of ideas or the working out of a set of ideas, which is kind of there in Deneen and other conservative post-liberals. We're looking to a set of ideas that originated perhaps with the American founding, perhaps with Francis Bacon, mastery over nature and such, and arguing that we have just seen the working out of that kind of set of ideas and political systems. And what I wanted to just draw attention to is just how much our institutions have changed in the past 40 years, and that's important because there is a way of defining liberalism. I think this is very key to a lot of the big shifts and the big kind of planting of flags that a lot of liberals make in the mid-20th century, and arguably before too, by the way, but where you define liberalism in terms of a set of institutions. And my point is to say these institutions don't exist anymore, or the function of them has so radically changed that we have to be attentive to that. And the drawback with a lot of post-liberals, a lot of conservative post-liberals, and I agree with them on a lot of things, right? Some of my best friends, right, et cetera. But well, one of the drawbacks of that kind of framing is that it's less attentive to some of these institutional shifts. And I wanted to make that clear and put that at the forefront of helping us understand what has happened in the past 40 years or so.
Yeah. So again, very unsettling. It is part of your objective, which is beautiful, and so you're trying to draw attention to it. It reminds me of our comments about MacIntyre and just wanting to say, listen, people, this is what's going on. You better wake up and look at it. There's one comment in here. You said governments long ago breached the barrier separating the public and private realms. And you also say, quote, rather, political interests have become wholly to dominate economic and financial interests, fusing state and society together, end quote. And there's an essay, and I don't assume that you know the essay. It's by Garrett Garrett in 1938, and it's titled "The Revolution Was." And he talks about how we've already gone through a revolution. There's already been this rise of managerialism. It was a big term, in the 1940s, James Burnham and the administrative state. And it reminded me of some of the things that the John Marini, the West Coast Straussians talking about unmasking the administrative state. So I'm wondering, do you have any of those ideas in the back of your mind, sort of the administrative state, or are you trying to distinguish your argument from that crowd of writers? Are you a West Coast Straussian, Dr. Pinkoski?
Yeah. Well, again, I've learned a lot from that camp, and some of my best friends, et cetera, are West Coast Straussians. I think there's one big difference I wanted to just draw attention to, and this would be if I ever engage more on this explicit question. Or two, actually, let's say. Two big differences here. One is that for Marini and for other West Coast Straussians, we're looking at the big shifts that's happening between the 20s and 30s. And there's definitely a lot that goes on in that period, the rise of the New Deal, the kinds of administrative changes, the development of the administrative state under Roosevelt. And so you're looking to the progressive era as really a revolutionary moment. And I definitely agree with a lot of that. I think, though, what can get left out in that account is how revolutionary the 60s and the 70s were. So what often gets put out in those accounts, in the way that they're set up, is you tend to see Johnson's Great Society, or indeed in the American context, the kinds of constitutional changes that take place in the 1970s. And what I mean here, you might think, well, wait a minute, what Constitution wasn't changed in the 1970s? Well, there was a really, really concerted effort to involve the legislature more, the Congress more, in things that had otherwise been the purview of the executive branch, by which I mean here, the president, right? And this involved the proliferation of administrative law in ways that I think, if we're comparing it to the 20s and 30s, we just don't see the same parallels. Roosevelt definitely had an administrative state. I'm not denying that. But it's concerned with things like regulation of finance and commerce, right? Securities and Exchange Commission. Once you move into the world whereby you have an EPA, you open up a wide swath of regulation that can happen everywhere. It's not just restricted to one particular domain, because anything can potentially involve the environment and be subject to environmental regulations.
Right. And
that's I think, in administrative law terms, that's a major change that goes on in that period. So again, something that can get left out in West Post-Straussian. I think it's related to the second problem that I have, or the second criticism I make for that, is they would trace the influence of all this to Hegel. And again, the kind of notion that Woodrow Wilson introduces these set of ideas, and ideas have consequences. And I think that is certainly true. I wouldn't want to deny that thesis outright. A lot of what happens in the 1970s is just institutional changes, and then the proliferation of practices that emerge when you develop these kinds of institutions. When you create the civil rights law or the EPA, your intentions may be in one direction, but in practice, what that does is allows for the proliferation of administrative regulations that cover most of not just commercial life, but social life. Yeah. So that's the kind of changes that I think we need to look at a little closely. And I think if I were making criticisms of my West Post-Straussian friends on that, I'd say descriptively, they're not so good at accounting what happens in that period. And then more in terms of method. It's not just about ideas working out and the long shadow of Hegel moving its way through the political system. It's a basic question of changing the law. The law got changed, and that had effects on the kind of regime that Americans live in. And I'm just being a good old Aristotelian on this, right? You change the law and you change the regime. That means you're changing the soul of the citizens.
Yeah. Well, the brilliance too in your approach is, I thought, doggone it, this guy is taking an historical empiricist approach. Like this is hardcore, old-fashioned philosophical conservatism, where he says, well, okay, ideas are great, but let's actually look at what exactly happened and try to make sense of it from there. It's an inductive. Anyways, I don't want to. I'm going to embarrass you by complimenting you too much. Let's get back to your article here. So you started right from the 1970s, and we won't spend hours and hours on this, but I do think it's important for people to see. You say in 1971, Richard Nixon decided to suspend the convertibility of the dollar to gold. And then a little bit lower down on that same page, you say, there was a commitment to the following constitutional amendment, quote, there shall be open borders, end quote. So maybe you could just make a few comments about that, abandoning the gold standard, and then the concept of open borders, free trade, and the open society.
Yeah. So the background point here, I think, is we often see, if you pick up the newspaper or you pick up long form articles, people talk about the post-war order kind of existing all the way up to the present, and then often it's said you pick 2016 as the break point, right? Oh, because of Brexit or because of Trump, the system had falls apart, or it's been challenged in unprecedented ways. And one of the things that got me interested in this project was, I thought, okay, what are the chief characteristics of what actually is the post-war order? What was developed coming out of the Second World War? Well, the big thing is Bretton Woods. And then you think, well, hold on, Bretton Woods doesn't exist anymore. Well, so if we're talking about the continuation of the post-war order, why is it that one of the things that was critical to the architecture of coming out of the Second World War, critical to the architecture of ensuring that you didn't have that same experience again. It doesn't exist anymore. And it ended in the 1970s. So that was one thing where I thought, well, okay, there's no people who are talking about continuity. Maybe they have something to hide. Maybe they're trying to avoid reckoning with this. So that's I think the first aspect that I wanted to draw attention to. And then the second thing there, my reference to the Wall Street Journal's proposal for a constitutional amendment is just this is, I think, the deeper point here is that our conception of the nation and our conception of representation and what it is to be embedded in a particular place and develop an economy that is embedded in a particular place. That's something that changed in the late 70s, in the 80s, and then really kind of was applied in the 1990s. And that analysis itself is not new. If you were looking or reading critics of neoliberalism, you definitely focus on that as a big change. And then I said embedded there. That's a big word or a loaded term, I think, better putting a loaded term in Polanyi's vocabulary. But what I wanted to point out, and this is something that a lot of critics of neoliberalism don't talk about as much, is how much this has to do with our movement or our acceptance or widespread acceptance, not just of labor mobility and flow of labor mobility across borders, but of mass immigration. And this is part of the major shift that we have in the latter part of the 20th century, the normalization of this. So it's not just something temporary. We don't just have a few guest workers who come for a few years and maybe some of them stay and it's kind of an awkward question. But we really have the movement towards a whole different political form that accepts that and encourages that and wants more and more of it. Yeah. And that's what I was trying to point out there. And that's a big difference, just to go back to post-war, right? There's a big difference from that particular period where there was such a strong desire, as the critics of neoliberalism point out, and they're very good on showing what the economic order was, or the goals of it after the Second World War. It was very much about trying to strengthen representative institutions, give those representative institutions a chance to shape the economy. And partly what underlying that is the sense that there's a fixed population that looks to, say, Parliament or looks to the legislature to represent its interests. It's kind of like a classic vision of the Labour Party in Britain. What's the Labour Party there for? The Labour Party is to represent the interests of the British working class. And all that gets upset and dislodged when you start normalizing disembodied labor force, which is to say the labor force of mass immigration, which could be taken from all over the world, not just in one particular place.
Yeah. So again, the reason I love but also get upset with your article is you destroy all my favorite heuristics. The post-war liberal order has been a favorite term of mine, I guess maybe from Rusty Reno's Strong Gods book. It just seems like such a beautiful way to describe what's happening. You know, we have this perfect linear post-war liberal order that gets questioned maybe in 9/11, but really with the global financial crisis in 2008, and then with Trump coming down the escalator in 2015, and Brexit, and then Trump's election in 2016. And so we have all of these beautiful dominoes that we can line up, and it just seems so neat and tidy. And then Dr. Pinkoski comes along and says, no, your heuristic actually doesn't fit with reality at all. And so I'm really looking forward to your book to get more sophisticated on it. Sorry, I don't know if that sparks a comment. You look like you're going to say something.
Well, simply, I think that I definitely agree with a lot of those accounts. I think, though, that there's a big difference between the level of the ideas and the level of what is happening to the institutions. And partly what we've seen, and I really think the 90s is interesting, and the 2000s especially for this, is we use this language of free and open society when our institutions are operating in a way that doesn't. And so the free and open society, that's one of the things that Reno writes very well about in The Strong Gods. This is the Karl Popper's language. And it kind of carries on from that notion that the open society is what we is what we want to have. But the institutions have changed in really dramatic ways. And so the language that we use is sometimes oblivious to those changes. People using it don't really understand the way they operate or don't want to understand. And then second, I think, and this is where I think drawing from kind of a critique of ideology perspective is very useful, right? The language masks some of the big changes. We talk about kind of classic, simple example. We talk in the language of free and open society, and yet with the application of the war on terror, our institutions operate in extremely different ways that have nothing to do with being free or open.
Yeah. So let's get right into that then. You mentioned the 90s and you talk about the Clintons. There's a line here. You say, quote, the Clintonians were learning from domestic politics. In that sphere, they were launching a revolution from government to governance, what Christopher Caldwell describes as the great innovation of the Clinton administration. And then on the next page, you say, you're quoting them, they say, quote, we should pursue our goals through an enlarged circle, not only of government officials, but also of private and non-governmental groups. Oh, that was Lake said that.
Lake, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So explain, what do you mean by that? Now government's starting to use non-government organizations.
Well, this is, I think, the part of the kind of the quiet revolution, right? To use a Canadian term, right? Quiet revolution of the 1990s that a lot of people were speaking about to government, and it's not just wanted to change it, and it's not just privatization, which is or deregulation, which are the terms that often get put about if you're talking to more left of center people who are critical of that kind of war. It's not just that. What they wanted to do was they wanted to develop particular partnerships between the state and these sometimes for-profit actors, but often not-for-profit actors, NGOs and such that weren't operating on a monetary basis. And this was, I think, key for their innovation for what kind of system they wanted to develop in post-building. And there are a couple major changes that come about in that framework, which I think we have seen in the last few years. These changes have really come home to roots. But I'll just give two quick examples of what I mean by this at a more theoretical level. One is when you develop these partnerships, you can actually extend the reach of the state even further. So the critic of neoliberalism will say, look, the state has withdrawn and has given up all these things over to the privates. But when you have an NGO that can operate off the recommendations, off perhaps the rule and orders of the state, you can actually achieve and reach state power further and further. And that's, by the way, Lake is very interested in that, because what's his objective in that speech? It's a foreign policy speech. His objective is extending democracy promotion further and further. So if you can get the NGOs to do that rather than your own government actor, say your CIA doesn't have to be involved in engaging with sponsoring magazines or trying to strengthen an opposition, you can get the NGO to do it. Well, it's extending the action of the government. And the second thing is, and we can just use the same example just to be brief here, right? The second thing that happens with this kind of state-society partnership is it's harder to tell who is in charge. It's the action of organized irresponsibility, we'll say irresponsibility. So the society actor, let's use the CIA example again, right? You have, imagine you have an NGO that's operating in some Eastern European country, and the NGO is involved in building up an opposition to the government. And someone comes along and says, the US government is trying to overthrow the legitimately elected government that is in that area. The State Department and the U.S. government says, no, of course not. We're not involved in that at all. Our CIA and our intelligence agencies are not engaged in that kind of activity. So it's a good way to disavow and distance. When in actual fact, there might be a much closer relationship. It's just not the relationship of the thing that we imagine when we think of the Cold War, right? And United States propping governments up around the world. It's not that kind of relationship anymore. Meanwhile, the society organization, right, can be subject to the same thing, where someone tries to press on what its objectives are and what it's doing there. It says, "Oh well, we're trying to follow the directions as they proceed from and out of the general speeches that the State Department has given on how organizations that are affiliated with the United States operate abroad." So you see this back and forth where it's not clear who's actually making the decision, and that, again, the innovation, right? This is a revolution that takes place in the 1990s. That's my contention. And develop this kind of new architecture that becomes more and more popular in the decade after the 90s.
Yeah. And you don't say this in your article, but it makes me, or it reminds me of some of the arguments that I've made that are really ancient arguments. You think von Mises making these arguments in his book on socialism, saying that, no, that's an old way of thinking to say that the government had to own the means of production. And he said, no, that's passé. We just have to control the means of production. And Marcuse made the same comment in the 1960s. He said, no, you don't need to own anything. You just need to be able to regulate it. Now, just to be clear again, you're not talking about regulation. You're talking about actually partnership, and perhaps influence would be a more fair term. Or perhaps are you talking about directly regulating NGOs as well?
Well, sometimes that's the way it operates. You have the proliferation of directives that come from the state actor that constrain or set up the way that NGOs operate. So, to give a quick example of this, it's a very present-day example, but one that describes the culmination of this relationship. So, under the Digital Services Act, passed to the European Union designates NGOs to be, what's the term? Another term, official flaggers, or sorry, designated flaggers. Designated flaggers. And the job of that NGO is to report hate speech, untoward activities on the internet, untoward posts, and draw them to the attention both of the platform, Facebook or whatever, and also the government to line up prosecutions. So here you have a kind of the juridification, shall we say, of informers who are regulated and set up to operate within this broader apparatus, internet censorship.
Right.
Let's call it for what it is, right? And the way it operates is you have regulated and codified the role that particular NGOs play in removing certain posts from the internet, as well as enabling prosecutions to take place for the people who put those posts together. So it's a regulatory apparatus. It's an apparatus that is a kind of partnership. The state is working with certain designated organizations. And by the way, the state often funds these organizations. So there's in Germany, for instance, you have these organizations. One's called Respect RE Capital, and they receive, if I recall, quarter of their funding from directly from the German government. And there are other examples of this as well. I may be off on the numbers, so don't quote me. The fact checkers can get me on this. The designated flaggers can get me.
That's right.
There are a number of these kinds of organizations. Another one, Hate Aid, which receives similar amounts. And indeed, that might be the one. But be as it may, that's the way this works.
Yeah. And so you're describing what I think you've set up as a post-2001 era. But just before we leave the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I thought you did a nice job of saying that really what was ostensibly a pursuit of globalism was actually more an asymmetrical setup with American economic and military control at the center, and more of a hub and spokes approach to openness and globalization. And yet it changed then again in 2001. So I wonder if you want to make a few comments about, just before we leave the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you're really saying that, no, what you guys were calling a completely open, neoliberal, global economic approach wasn't really that in reality. Or have I read you wrong there?
No, I think that's exactly it. And one of the points, I don't really make this in the article, but it's something I think about a lot, has to do with when you're laying the groundwork for the information revolution, which of course is the thing that gets all the excitement in the 1990s. But that's not just a phenomenon of the abstract virtual world, the internet, right? You need hardware in order to make that work. You need to have laying the electronic cables, and the whole development of telecommunications enables that to take place. That's the way the internet is first set up. And what happens at that moment, and it's not by kind of grand design, it's more or less just by accident, kind of path dependency stuff, you might say. Those hard networks, the hardware, if you will, of the digital of the information revolution, is laid to pass through the United States. It goes through, say, Virginia is one of the key sites, Northern Virginia, where a lot of this infrastructure comes in. And the other thing I would say about this too is the information revolution that makes instant exchange of on finance, exchange of financial amounts possible. This also runs through a few concentrated locations. London obviously plays a role, but New York is the big one. So if we have the internet side of the information revolution going through Northern Virginia, and we have the financial side of the information revolution going through New York, well, that makes one country right at the very center. And what I sort of think happened is people began to be, in the US government, began to be aware that, well, actually, we have a lot of power. We're sitting atop this whole structure. And the old paradigm would tell us we need to be neutral and impartial and sit back and let this happen. But we discover more and more, or become more and more aware of perhaps trying to use this to a political end.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that totally weaves in with your argument as well. So I'm asking way too many questions. We're going to not get to your other articles, but there's a few more questions I have to ask about this article. So you talk about September 11th, 2001, and you say this, that, quote, to strike back at Al-Qaeda, they banished the old liberal mentality and its hesitations about weaponizing the private economy, end quote. And really, the next few pages, you just gave a beautiful list of examples all the way up to Russia, Crimea, and sanctions. And so I wonder if you could make a few comments and tie together. And you also say in there too, in February 22nd, just before the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the Canadian government deployed the financial weapons of war against its own citizens. So I hope, is it possible for you to make a comment on 2 decades of geopolitical history in a few minutes?
I'll do my best to be super quick about it. Look, this is what I was talking about earlier, the working out of the extension of the reach and the organized irresponsibility, where it's not clear who's actually making this. Extension of reach point. Through sanctions and through secondary sanctions, where you tell certain financial companies what the rules are, you're going to be punished if you trade with these actors, and then you encourage other basically financial entities to implement those rules on themselves and their own customers. You're able to extend the power of the government, of your political power, far further than you ever guessed. And this was used to great success in the 2000s by doing financial strangulation of Al-Qaeda. It was really became very, very difficult for it to garner the resource. And so the power has been extended. You can reach further than you ever thought possible before. I mean, people just didn't think that you could deal with terrorism in this way, except for a few innovators who saw what it meant to be at the top of this whole system of telecommunications, what it meant to be at the top of in control of the tools of the information revolution. And they wanted to go further. And so they began targeting banks associated with states. One famous incident with a North Korean bank was a good example of this. So now you're targeting the banks associated with rogue states, so-called rogue states. And then you think, well, why not target the states themselves? And that's what happens with Iran, where the sanctions are turned onto the Iranian central bank, and the effort is to basically do what you did to Al Qaeda, cut them out of the financial system entirely. And that was pretty successful with Iran up to a point, but it certainly the Iranians felt the pressure. And this is where I think there's kind of hubris that got built into the mentality of people using. We can just keep using these tools to get out after everyone, to go after everyone. And 2022 is really a decisive moment for this, because the thought is, well, let's use this to take down a $3 trillion. Let's use this to target the Russian central bank, and knock them out of the global economy. And what happened was that it failed. The Russians actually, it was a tough moment for them, and they're still feeling some of the effects. But their position was strong enough that they could resist and turn back. And so not only did the strategy fail, you also revealed to the whole world and really made it clear that when you're doing business with the Americans, you have to be subordinate to their political objectives. And that is the phenomenon that has prompted the decline, the erosion of the dollar as reserve currency. Yeah, it's small, it's just a trickle effect, but it's definitely picked up. And it's definitely gotten a lot of people much more interested in alternative ways to alternative financial transactions across borders. So here we have the tools being used, the one stretching further and further, and they've run up against hard limits, and we're still trying to reckon with that. And then briefly, just on the Canadian point, going on a bit, but
you don't have to rush. No, there's no limit. We could talk for hours if you want. I just feel bad for your time.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's all right. I still got some more time, so all's well. But in the Canadian case, what you have is a kind of diffusion as to who's actually making the order. Is it the Canadian government that is coercing, that is seizing your assets? No, it's the financial company that, under pressure from the is freezing your assets and so forth. So it's that ambiguity as to how those two entities work together that is key. And this is also true. A great example of this is in the American context around COVID, just because a lot of this information has now become publicly available, where you saw now that the state was putting a lot of pressure on the social media companies to close down accounts. And what's happened since then is the social media companies, Zuckerberg and such, they've made a big protest and said, well, look, we're being forced to do it. We are being forced to do it. And then the state says, well, no, we aren't actually forcing you to do it. That was your own decision. So it's this ambiguity as to how this plays out. And of course, Zuckerberg, when he gives these kinds of arguments, a lot of people are skeptical with good reason for it, because they went along with what was being asked of them. So the irresponsibility here, where it's hard to tell who's actually in charge, is key of these state-society partnerships of this actually existing post-liberal world.
Right. But the bottom line is, as you say here, quote, state and corporate goals had been fused together long before the 2022 truckers convoy and then like 9/11, COVID, etc.
Well, just simply that we have this mentality, and a lot of us still do. The private sector is skeptical of government, or the private sector wants to defend its own constituents. And my point simply with that is to say, look, we're long past the world where the private sector thinks in that point. In fact, in the Canadian case, you saw, and some of this is anecdotal behind doors things that I've been told. I don't know how much it's been out in the public now, but the banks were enthusiastic to do the bidding of the RCMP. They're you're asking us to shut down 100 accounts. Well, we'll go further. Here, take even more accounts. So the notion that they have some kind of desire to protect their own clients and take care of the interests of their own clients is not true anymore.
No. And as you say, it probably hasn't been true since 2001. And so just a few comments, and we'll finish up with this article. You say, quote, in short, liberalism was a product of the post-war moment. Its time has ended. After the conclusion of the Cold War, British elites traded on the glories of the post-war moment to purify the British people, removing the stains of xenophobia, Euroscepticism, and racism. But when pressed, these elites thought that the post-war era offered little of lasting significance beyond anti-fascism. And then again, you summarize the article, last paragraph, first sentence, quote, "The central drama of the last 3 decades has been the fusion of state and society," end quote. So I'm really looking forward to your book. I think it'll be, I'm not surprised that you got a book contract out of this. That was just really fantastic. Any closing comments on that article before we touch briefly on one more article?
The only thing I would simply say is that I think we just need to see the 90s as a revolutionary period. We're fine not to think of it like that, as a period of calm. And my central contention is that it's the quiet revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love reading John Gray, and he
Hmm.
was writing a lot of stuff in the 1990s. One of the books I love is called Enlightenment's Wake, and it's a collection of essays that seem to overlap with some of the things you're saying. He's really
Yeah, exactly. I think he was someone who saw this phenomenon very, very well. People don't know, but he wrote in 1989 an essay for National Review, which was already questioning the end of history concept. And I think you can compare that to Fukuyama's essay, and Gray, I think, was the better prophet.
Yes, yeah. So I'm glad you like him too. Then, yeah, that's why I like you, because we agree on so many things. Although you do make me feel awfully uncomfortable with that article, which I enjoy in a weird way. But I wanted to just end. Do you have a few more minutes to chat?
Yeah, absolutely. I can go for about 15 more minutes, 20 more
Okay,
minutes.
okay. We won't use that much of your time, but I wanted you to make a comment on an article that you wrote. I think this is also First Things, but it's titled "The End of Trudeau's Post-Caesarism." And
Pseudo-Caesarism. That one?
yeah, not post. The End of Trudeau's Pseudo-Caesarism, and that's from January 2025. And you talk about how when you voted for Obama, you weren't voting for the Democratic Party. Quote, "The person was the message," end quote. Can you just unpack that concept a little bit? I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking about there is the notion that in the early 21st century, you kind of had these progressive figures. Blair is a similar kind of figure too, who kind of intended to embody through their personality, partly through their charisma, but a notion of you trust this particular person to lead one forward. And it's not about trust in the party establishment. Blair, for instance, is famously at odds and hostile with his own party, right? When he's trying to pull it along, and part of the drama of Blairism is the Labour Party's too caught up in the past, and we're trying to update it and change it to kind of reflect this new youthful personality. And so Obama is that kind of figure too, I think, in the American context. And we should see too how much he was successful at changing the identity of the Democrat Party. I mean, it's a party that did pretty poorly in a lot of local state elections during that period, but it really gets definitively reinvented as a party for the college educated, or the ones whose concerns are identity. And the old party that had its root basis in the white working class, that party fades away during that time. So the point is you trust the person. That the person is what embodies the forward motion, the progress, and you're putting that in. And Justin Trudeau's the Canadian version of this.
Have we gone beyond that phase, or are we still in that pseudo-Caesarism era?
Well, it's a great question. I'm of two minds about it. I think there's definitely an attraction toward those kinds of figures. And partly why it's pseudo is what those people did is ultimately gestured towards more power to the experts, more power to the bureaucrats, administrative state, to go back to what we were saying earlier. And that kind of came their way of demonstrating their authority, right? I am here to tell you to trust the scientists. That's why I'm standing in front of the stage. We're going to trust the science. That's kind of their role. And there's definitely a lot of people who still model that way of government. That said, I think it's really interesting to go to a British example here. I guess you could maybe talk about Carney in the similar kind of lens, where a lot of it is this kind of to tap into that constituency and to win. You're leaning much more into the tropes of personal authority. I'm in charge. You can trust me. I'm going to be tough with the Americans. Elbows up, the sort of thing. Like these metaphors of physical aggression. Keir Starmer, the way he talks about border control now, right, is almost it's almost to the right of the Republican. Well, it is to the right of the Republican Party in the United States. The kinds of measures that he proposes, it's things that you would not be able to get through Congress, and partly because, in large part, because of opposition from the Republicans. So it's this notion of the metaphors, the image of national sovereignty, is a big part of what we see now. Is it real? Is this the way that they're actually trying to govern, or is it a rhetoric? Well, I don't know, but I think it is interesting that the rhetoric is very different. Kind of symbols you lean into are very different. So I think I would say that this era of pseudo-Caesar, progressive pseudo-Caesarism, does seem to, at least for now, be on the wane. And what we see instead is the rise of Caesarism. People want to. It's much more authentic Caesarism, or at least there's a pretense to try to speak in those terms. Trust the leader to effect change. Trust the leader to take back control. These kinds of aspects.
Yeah, brilliant. So I was just speaking with Daniel Pitt, philosopher in Britain, and he wrote a paper recently called Constitutional Rhetoric. So I was just flipping back in my notes. And he looked at the last 27 years, 30 years of rhetoric within the Conservative Party in Britain, so from John Major to Boris Johnson, and trying to, he used the rubric of ethos, logos, pathos, or pathos, and tried to determine what they were relying on. And he said he didn't anticipate it, but he said most of their language was around pathos, so appealing to emotion and inflammatory rhetoric. And I wonder if the pseudo-Caesarism falls within the ethos. Certainly it's not logos. We're not getting elected based on ideas anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of describing it. And that's partly the world that we've left behind, at least in the way that we see it. I'll have to read this article.
Yeah, I'll share it with you. It's fun. So what keeps you awake at night? What this is the final question. What should we be thinking about that we're not?
Well, look, one of the big things I think is I'm in focus right now on the 90s. That's what I'm writing about, thinking about. So a lot of my intellectual energy is there, but looking more closely at the 70s might be part of it. I think about René Girard and scapegoating during that time, and I think about the role that Richard Nixon played as a kind of national scapegoat, perhaps to take the fall for some of the problems that developed in the American polity and perhaps the Western polity writ large in the late 60s, early 70s. So that's a more complicated argument, but the general thought is we have with someone like René Girard the notion of scapegoating, and looking for how that applies in the political setting is very interesting. An example of this, perhaps less, doesn't need to be filled out as much as Nixon's case would be, is the case of Capitaine Dreyfus in under the Third Republic. The Dreyfus affair is a famous instance why people look at it through the lens of scapegoating. I'm wondering what other instances like this take place.
Yeah, fascinating. So you're reminding me of Joshua Mitchell's book on the American Awakening, and how he's saying really what's going on is not cultural Marxism and even postmodernism. So he really tears down those heuristics or rubrics for understanding modern social malaise. And he says this is really just old-fashioned identity politics, where we look for a scapegoat and you try to innocence signal, and we paint the doorposts of our office with environmental paraphernalia or LGBT flags or whatever.
Yeah, rainbow flag. Yeah.
Yeah, but Gerard certainly was much beyond that and deeper into that. So that's
Well,
fascinating.
Mitchell draws upon Girard for that, so it's a good example of this kind of way of thinking. And there's a lot of richness here. I think that we would do better to look at. Yeah, I guess the general kind of takeaway in the end is we have a lot of these neat stories about the role that particular ideas play, or set of ideas like cultural Marxism, but people like Mitchell and hopefully, myself, much more junior and in the path of things than Joshua Mitchell is, but to be part of a growing trend of those who are looking at things a little differently and not so leaning so heavily onto blaming everything on Marcuse and nothing.
And you can actually show the world that you can survive without wearing liberalism on your sleeve academically. Yeah, brilliant. So thank you so much, Nathan. This has been fantastic. I wish you all the best. I can't wait till your book comes out, and I look forward to the next time we can talk, perhaps at a conference or something. And
wonderful.
So where can people find your work?
So I have a Substack with the George Grant title called Lament for the Nations. So nations with an S there. That's one way that people can follow me. Otherwise, I write mostly for First Things and for Compact. Those are the venues that I have. I'm also on Twitter/X if people want to follow me there.
Perfect. Thanks so much. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you again. A pleasure to talk.